It was a humid Saturday afternoon in August of 2012. 55-year-old Thomas Rybinski stood at the helm of his boat, steering it across the lake near his home in Tennessee. He'd spent all day on the water with his wife Colette and a few friends, and it had been the perfect day for boating. Hot and steamy, but with a light breeze sweeping across the lake. Thomas couldn't believe that he'd almost canceled on his wife and friends that morning. He'd woken up with a headache and an upset stomach, but Colette had made him some coffee, which had helped him feel better, and once he was up and moving, Thomas felt okay, still a bit shaky, but good enough to keep their boating date with their friends. Thomas was actually accustomed to having to push through discomfort. He had chronic back pain from an old accident that flared up every time he rode his motorcycle, went on a strenuous hike, or really did any sort of strenuous activity at all. But Thomas loved exercising and being outdoors, and so he wasn't about to stop doing those things just because of a little backache. And he also got cortisone injections every month, which helped manage the pain in his back. Thomas was feeling especially grateful to be boating as he looked out over the bow, navigating the boat around a corner toward a little cove. Once he was in the cove, he dropped the anchor, and Colette started unpacking the food they'd brought for dinner. A few hours later, Thomas was halfway through a lively story about his recent hiking trip to Colorado when he felt a tap on his arm. It was Colette, and he knew she was giving him the signal that it was about time to head back. Thomas looked up and realized the sun was starting to set. He'd been having such a nice time, he really hadn't noticed how late it was getting, and he knew they wanted to be tied up at the dock by nightfall. So Thomas helped his wife pack up quickly, then he pulled up the anchor line and steered the boat back to shore. About a week later, on the following Friday morning, Thomas sat at his desk at General Motors, looking over a blueprint. For years, Thomas had worked as an automotive designer, and right now, he was designing a new vehicle interior. He doodled ideas on a spare sheet of paper as he brainstormed. But today, he was just drawing a blank. In fact, the only thing he could even think about was the pounding going on in his head. Last weekend's headache that almost made him cancel that boating outing had come back. And it actually had gotten worse and worse throughout this last week. Now the pain was sharp and persistent, like somebody was snapping a rubber band against his temples over and over again. Thomas put his elbows on his desk and cradled his face, trying to block out the stark overhead lighting in his office. Thomas hated the idea of leaving work early, but for the first time in years, he was debating whether or not he should go home sick. But ultimately, after rubbing his eyes and thinking about it for a second, he decided he would just try to tough it out. If he was going to have a headache, he figured he'd rather have it here, where at least he could attempt to kind of occupy his mind for a moment by working on a project that he loved. But once the clock in his office finally reached 5 p.m., Thomas was so ready to get out of there. He packed up and headed home for the weekend, glad to have the next 2 days to rest up and recharge. But that weekend, his headache didn't go away, and on Sunday morning, Thomas awoke to some of the worst pain he'd ever felt in his life. He turned over in bed and told Colette that it felt like the inside of his head was about to explode. Colette looked totally shocked, and Thomas knew why. He never complained about pain. So for him to say something like this meant it must be really serious. And so Thomas didn't even argue when Colette told him they had to go see a doctor. About an hour later, at the Vanderbilt University Medical Center, a doctor named Annie Wilkins walked into an exam room. Thomas was her first patient of the day. He was sitting on the exam table, clutching his head with his hands, while Colette rubbed his back. And so from the moment Dr. Wilkins saw Thomas, she could tell he was in immense pain. Dr. Wilkins asked Thomas to lift his head up for a moment so she could give him a routine examination. But as Dr. Wilkins moved her finger around in front of Thomas's face, she noticed that his eyes were struggling to follow it. In fact, it didn't seem like Thomas could focus on anything at all. That lack of focus, coupled with this extreme headache he was describing, made Dr. Wilkins suspect that Thomas had an infection in his brain, a condition called meningitis. She wondered if he had been exposed to something out of the ordinary that could cause meningitis, and so she asked him if he'd traveled anywhere new recently. Thomas nodded and said actually he'd just gotten back from a hiking trip in Colorado, and that was a red flag to Dr. Wilkins. Anytime a patient mentioned hiking, she knew that tick bites could be a factor. Ticks can be infected with bacteria and viruses and can spread diseases through their bites. Dr. Wilkins wondered if maybe Thomas had been bitten by a tick in Colorado and developed something called Rocky Mountain spotted fever, whose symptoms include meningitis. To find out, Dr. Wilkins told Thomas that he would need to undergo a spinal tap so the lab could study his spinal fluid for signs of disease. First, she wanted to know whether or not he had meningitis, and then also whether or not Rocky Mountain spotted fever caused the meningitis. Thomas grimaced at the thought of a needle going into his spine, but the doctor told him really it was no big deal and they would have answers soon. About 90 minutes later, Dr. Wilkins received the first results from the spinal tap. Thomas did indeed have meningitis. So Dr. Wilkins asked a nurse to start Thomas on antibiotics right away, which would help reduce the swelling around Thomas's brain and his spinal cord. But about an hour later, Dr. Wilkins got a surprise when the rest of Thomas's lab results came back. Thomas's spinal fluid showed that he did not have Rocky Mountain spotted fever. In fact, there was no trace of any bacteria or virus in his spinal fluid at all, which left Dr. Wilkins feeling totally perplexed. She had been fairly confident that Thomas would test positive for Rocky Mountain spotted fever, and if not that, then definitely some other virus or bacteria. After all, viruses and bacteria cause the vast majority of meningitis cases. Dr. Wilkins knew that other invaders can also cause the disease, such as parasites, but that usually only happened to people who traveled internationally. And in extremely rare cases, patients could get meningitis from a fungus that lives on unsterilized surgical equipment, but Thomas hadn't had any surgeries. So Dr. Wilkins was at a total loss as she walked back towards Thomas's room. She found him inside, lying awake in bed, with his wife Colette sitting nearby in a chair. Dr. Wilkins was relieved to see Thomas looking much more alert than when he'd come into the hospital a few hours ago. The antibiotics already seemed to be helping him. Colette stood to greet Dr. Wilkins and then quickly asked her if they knew what was wrong with her husband. But Dr. Wilkins had to be honest and said no, she didn't know yet. She was going to keep Thomas in the hospital for a few days. That way, they could keep an eye on him as the antibiotics fought the infection. But she still did not know what had caused this infection in the first place. Over the next few days, Thomas steadily recovered, and on the 5th morning of his hospital stay, Dr. Wilkins was glad to see that Thomas was nearly back to his usual self. He wasn't in pain, and he no longer seemed groggy. Dr. Wilkins felt so confident about Thomas's condition that she actually discharged him from the hospital so he could finish recovering at home. 1 week later, on September 7th, an epidemiologist named Dr. April Petit returned to work at Vanderbilt University Medical Center after a week off. She began her day by looking over her patients' charts, and one caught her eye. Thomas Rybinski was back at the hospital and had just been transferred by Dr. Wilkins to Dr. Petit's care. Dr. Petit looked closer at his chart, and she saw that Thomas had been given a 2-week treatment of antibiotics to take at home, but after only a few days of that, he'd felt so sick that he had to come back to the hospital. Dr. Petit made her way to Thomas's room, and when she went inside, she saw Thomas laying in bed with a dazed look on his face. His wife Colette was sitting by his side, and she explained that Thomas had been acting confused all morning, and also, for the past few days, he'd been complaining of lower back pain. Dr. Petit nodded and then walked over to Thomas's bedside and gently asked him how he was feeling. And Thomas looked up at her, but he had this look on his face like he didn't understand the question, and then he just stayed silent. Dr. Petit frowned, knowing her job just got much more difficult because clearly Thomas was not going to be able to tell her exactly how he was feeling. All she'd have to go on was Thomas's medical records and anything Colette could tell her. Dr. Petit suspected that Thomas's meningitis must have flared up again. So she ordered an MRI of Thomas's spine and brain, as well as another spinal tap. She also started Thomas on a new cocktail of antibiotics, and she asked the lab to test his spinal cord fluid again to try to find the cause of this infection. Later that evening, Dr. Petit stopped by Thomas's room to check on him, and she was pleasantly surprised to see that he already seemed to be improving. But as she headed home that night, she couldn't help but still feel nervous for Thomas. After all, they thought he was getting better once before, and now he was back in the hospital, sicker than ever. Six days later, on September 13th, Dr. Petit arrived for an early morning shift, feeling sleepy as she drank the last sips of the coffee she'd gotten on the way to work. The moment she sat down in her office, her pager went off, calling her to Thomas Rybinski's room. Dr. Petit had a bad feeling. Even though Thomas had improved slightly in his first afternoon back in the hospital, he was incoherent again by the next morning, just as Dr. Petit had feared. And he'd only been getting worse as the week wore on. When she arrived in his room and said hello to Thomas, she immediately noticed that the right side of his face was completely slack. His features were drooping, and Dr. Petit suspected that Thomas had suffered a stroke. And so she pressed the call button because Thomas would need a brain scan right now. An hour later, Dr. Petit received the brain scan results, which showed that the arteries at the back of Thomas's head were blocked. They also showed a pool of blood where Thomas's brain and spinal column met. Dr. Petit shook her head. Thomas definitely suffered a stroke. She knew that this damage was caused by something that was trying to invade Thomas's brain. But what was it? Thomas's spinal fluid was still free of bacteria and viruses. It made no sense. And yet there had to be some logical answer. Dr. Petit just needed to find it. The next morning, when Dr. Petit arrived at the hospital, she found a shocking lab result waiting for her. At last, she knew what was causing Thomas's meningitis. But the answer was truly bizarre. The infection came from a fungus that normally would not cause disease in healthy patients like Thomas, and so it seemed impossible. But the lab results were undeniable. A shiver ran down Dr. Petit's spine. Fungal meningitis is not only rare, but it's also deadly. Many patients die from it, even with proper treatment, and so Dr. Petit raced down the hall to order new medication for Thomas, hoping they were not too late. 5 days later, on September 18th, Dr. Petit sat in her office, combing through medical journals. She was still stunned over Thomas's diagnosis and was trying to find a published study that might help her understand how Thomas's brain had been invaded by fungus. But it was not until late afternoon that she finally landed on an article that piqued her interest. The article was about a cluster of fungal meningitis outbreaks that occurred following a devastating 2004 tsunami in the Indian Ocean. Following the tsunami, pregnant women began developing fungal meningitis after getting epidural shots in their spines with needles that had been stored in damp warehouses. The dampness turned out to be a breeding ground for fungus, which made these needles deadly. Dr. Petit wondered if something similar could have happened to Thomas, that he'd been injected with a fungus-covered needle. If that was the case, then other people might have gotten the same dangerous treatment. She began drafting an email to the Tennessee Department of Health. She needed to report Thomas's case right away. But as she typed, her pager went off. It was another alert about Thomas, and this time he was crashing. So Dr. Petit got up and raced out of her office and down the hall to Thomas's room, and when she went in there, she saw Colette in the corner crying, and a nurse who was right by Thomas's bedside preparing to intubate Thomas because Thomas had stopped breathing. That same afternoon, so on September 18th, Dr. Marion Kaner was answering emails from her desk at the Tennessee Department of Health, where she specialized in tracking infectious diseases. Dr. Kaner yawned and lifted her rimless glasses to rub her eyes. She was normally peppy and focused, but always seemed to get a bit tired when it was time to sign off for the day. But then an email labeled urgent popped into her inbox. The email was about Thomas Rybinski's rare case of fungal meningitis and his doctor's suspicion that it could have been caused by dirty needles. Dr. Petit had managed to stabilize Thomas, but he was in critical condition, and Dr. Petit was worried that others might get sick too. Initially, Dr. Kaner thought that Dr. Petit's worry about some kind of a fungal meningitis outbreak seemed far-fetched. That is, until she read a very interesting detail in Dr. Petit's letter. About 2 weeks before Thomas got sick, he had gone to a nearby clinic for a steroid injection to help with his chronic back pain. So it was at least possible that that clinic injected him with a dirty needle. Dr. Kaner was familiar with the clinic in question. She knew they saw about 160 patients each week, which meant that if one patient had been infected by a dirty needle, there were likely to be more cases. Dr. Kaner decided to launch an immediate investigation. Two days later, Dr. Kaner parked her car at the St. Thomas Pain Clinic, which was where Thomas had received his steroid injection. Earlier that morning, Dr. Kaner had received word that 2 additional patients had shown up at Tennessee hospitals with fungal meningitis, and both of them had also been treated at this St. Thomas Pain Clinic. Dr. Kaner called the clinic to inform them of the infections, as well as her suspicions that the pain clinic could be at fault. To her relief, the clinic director immediately volunteered to shut down until they could determine what was causing the meningitis. Dr. Kaner and a few colleagues got out of the car and walked inside the modern-looking clinic with big glass doors and tall windows. The clinic director came out into the waiting room to greet them. Dr. Kaner shook his hand and explained they would need to swab the entire clinic for signs of contamination. And the director said that was totally fine, take your time, and just said if you need anything from me, let me know. Dr. Kaner and her team followed the clinic director through the facility, which Dr. Kaner noticed was sparkling clean. The director showed her where supplies were kept, including syringes and needles. Then he walked them over to the industrial fridges where they kept the steroids and other medicines. The investigators took samples and got busy making sure everything was up to code. Meanwhile, Dr. Kaner kept an eye out for mold. She even got down on her hands and knees to inspect the refrigerators, but she found nothing. Dr. Kaner would still test the samples they'd collected, but she had to admit, the clinic appeared clean and safe. There were no expired steroids, no dirty instruments. It was clear the medical staff took great care of the place and followed protocol to a T. But for the purposes of Dr. Kaner's investigation, this actually was a big problem. Because if this clinic wasn't to blame for the 3 cases of fungal meningitis amongst the clinic patients, then something much bigger must be going on. Dr. Kaner thanked the clinic director before heading back to her office, knowing it was time to alert the Centers for Disease Control, or CDC, the agency that handles national disease outbreaks. A few days later, Dr. Kaner sat in a conference call with researchers from the CDC who were calling from their headquarters in Atlanta, Georgia. After first contacting the CDC, Dr. Kaner had reached out to medical professionals all across the state. So far, she had received word of 1 confirmed death and 5 cases of suspected fungal meningitis. All of the cases were linked somehow to the St. Thomas Pain Clinic, but investigators couldn't find any source of contamination there. CDC investigators raised the possibility that the clinic could have received supplies that were already contaminated when they arrived, so they had started to carefully track these suppliers for every single item used at that clinic. They were checking not just the needles, but also the syringes, anesthetics, surgical dye, even the trays used to hold the instruments. But despite several days of work, they still had not found the source of infection yet. As Dr. Kaner listened in on this conference call, one of the investigators in Atlanta reminded everybody on the call that many of the patients at the St. Thomas Pain Clinic had received steroid injections to relieve their discomfort. So, if the clinic's needles weren't dirty, then maybe the problem was actually the steroids themselves. Another CDC official then added that it would be easy enough to check because all of the clinic's steroids had all come from the same place, the New England Compounding Center, or NECC for short, which was located in Framingham, Massachusetts. The CDC investigators said they should let NECC know which steroid batches were being linked to the meningitis cases. That way the company could recall the batches immediately. And so Dr. Kaner suddenly felt hopeful. She left the conference call feeling certain that NECC would recall the drugs and this meningitis scare would soon be over. At 6 a.m. on October 2nd, so a couple of weeks after Dr. Kaner began her investigation, a U.S. Food and Drug Administration investigator named Stacy DeGarmo pulled into the NECC's parking lot. One of her colleagues sat in the passenger seat taking photographs. Thomas Rybinski, whose case started the investigation, had now passed away from his fungal meningitis. So now, at least 2 people in Tennessee had died after receiving this steroid injection compounded at the NECC, and there were 14 other cases identified across the nation. But it had the potential to get much, much worse because NECC shipped so many steroids all over the country. Dr. Kaner and the CDC investigators had learned that the NECC had distributed 17,675 vials of potentially contaminated steroids across 23 different states. The Food and Drug Administration, or FDA, had quickly gotten involved and almost immediately decided they needed to pay NECC a physical visit. Lead FDA investigator, DeGarmo, was certain she would find the answers they needed inside the sort of bland-looking brown brick building where the NECC was headquartered. As DeGarmo looked across the parking lot, she immediately saw something troubling. There was a huge construction vehicle, like an excavator, with a big mechanical shovel that was tearing in to a pile of construction debris and other trash, spreading dust all around. A mess like that has no business being outside of a building where drugs are made. DeGarmo shook her head and climbed out of her car. She'd never been to NECC, but she was not surprised when she'd gotten a call about them from the CDC. Her agency had a history of run-ins with NECC, including a time 10 years earlier when their steroids had given a few patients meningitis-like symptoms. So if these executives at NECC were up to no good, well, DeGarmo was thrilled to be the one to ruin their day. DeGarmo and her colleague walked into the ground floor laboratory of the NECC, where two company executives stood waiting for them. They didn't look particularly pleased to be up so early, especially to be giving a tour to two FDA investigators. Still, DeGarmo followed after one executive, while her colleague went with the other. The executive that DeGarmo had followed led her through the laboratory, and DeGarmo noticed right away that the facility was absolutely filthy. As DeGarmo looked over documents, her colleague zipped on a gown, put a respirator on her face, and entered the facility's clean room, where most of the facility's lab work took place. DeGarmo remained outside because she was pregnant, but she watched through a window as her colleague moved methodically around the room, wiping surfaces with a sponge. When she finished with each sponge, she dropped it into a sterile bag so that the sponge and whatever was on it could be tested later. From the door, DeGarmo could see that one of the ovens used to sterilize the NECC drugs was obviously covered in this sort of brown muck. She watched with disgust as her colleague carefully swiped the oven and then dropped that dirty sponge into a bag. 12 hours later, DeGarmo and her colleague were exhausted, but they still were not done combing through the NECC lab. They needed several more days to finish their investigation as NECC lawyers raised one objection after another. Finally, on the third day of the FDA investigation into the NECC facility, NECC executives just straight up would not let DeGarmo back into the building. So the following week, on October 16th, Massachusetts health agents raided NECC, and they would make a staggering discovery. Not one, but 3 batches of steroids made at NECC were found to be contaminated, meaning that tens of thousands of infected vials had been sent out across the country, including to the St. Thomas Pain Clinic in Tennessee. Overall, NECC was a sanitary nightmare. Not only was the lab dirty, but the owners of the manufacturing center also owned a waste management business that was right next door. And investigators found that NECC's whole operation was pretty much illegal. They were mass-producing drugs that they had no legal right to make. And when investigators looked even more closely, they found the NECC had actually created thousands of imaginary patients just to make it seem like their operation was legitimate. All told, more than 100 people died from NECC's contaminated steroids, and almost 800 other people got sick in what was the worst pharmaceutical disaster in decades. NECC's supervising pharmacist, whose name was Glenn Chin, along with several other executives, were sent to jail over their role in creating the dangerous conditions in their facility. Prosecutors said they had all chosen profits over keeping patients safe. In January of 2015, a 27-year-old Texas man named George Pickering III suffered a massive stroke. He was immediately admitted to a hospital where he was put on life support, and then doctors delivered some bad news to his family. It would turn out George was brain dead, and they advised the family that realistically they should consider pulling George off of life support because it wasn't going to do him any good. George's family was totally devastated by this news. In fact, George's father was so upset he just left the hospital altogether. And so in his father's absence, George's mother and brother wound up talking to doctors and saying that yes, we are prepared to pull George off of life support. After they consented to have this done, they put George on an organ donor list and then began making funeral plans. When George's father came back to the hospital later that day and found out his family had consented to have George pulled from life support, he was furious. He did not believe his son was just totally brain dead and there was no hope. He felt like they should at least try to give him a little bit more time to potentially give them a signal that he was okay. But George's mother and brother told George's father that they had spoken to the doctors and there was just no hope. There was no reason to delay this process. It was time. But George's father was totally not having it. He stormed out of the room and he found the doctors and he demanded they keep his son on life support just a little bit longer. But the doctors told him there really is no reason to do that. And in fact, all you're doing is jeopardizing the people that need his organs, that are waiting for this organ transplant. And so really what we need to do is actually expedite taking him off of life support because that's the best thing to do right now. George's father was so upset, totally distraught. He ran back to his son's room. He laid over his son and he just held his hands and stared at him and just prayed that his son would give him some sign that he was actually not brain dead, but his son didn't. And before long, the doctors began filtering into the room to begin the procedure of removing his son from life support. And when they came in the room, George's father kind of snapped. He ran out of the room, he ran out of the hospital, he went out to his car and he got his gun and then ran back into the hospital, back into his son's room and aimed the gun at the doctors and ordered them to stop what they were doing and leave the room immediately. And so the doctors had not actually begun removing George from life support, so he's still on life support. And so once the doctors and everyone left the room, George's father walked over, he locked the door, and then for the next several hours, he just kept his gun aimed at the door as he laid over his son and just kept looking down in hopes that his son would give him some sign that he was not brain dead. And so finally, when the SWAT team arrived and was stacking up outside the door in the hallway, they began yelling into the room for George's father to put the gun down and let them come in. And George's father the whole time is just looking down at his son, hoping and praying that his son is just going to do something. And right as the SWAT team kicks in the door and comes into the room, George's father had reached down and grabbed his son's hand, and his son squeezed his hand back. And as soon as his father felt that, he dropped the gun and he surrendered peacefully to the SWAT team. And then the SWAT team put George's father on the ground. And as he's being detained, George's father is yelling for the doctors to come in the room. My son is okay. And sure enough, when the doctors came in the room, George was okay. He was moving his hand, his eyes were open, he was making good eye contact. And before long, he made a totally full recovery. He would later be told that had his father not stepped in when he did and bought him those extra few hours on life support, George would have died. As for George's father, he was ultimately sentenced to 10 months in prison for his aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, but he and the rest of his family think what he did was certainly worth going to prison for. In 1959, Ronald McNair was a very gifted 9-year-old African-American boy living in South Carolina. While he was good at virtually everything he tried, from music to athletics to schoolwork, the only thing that ever really grabbed his attention was outer space. And so as a 9-year-old child, he made the decision that one day he was going to become an astronaut. But he had no idea how to become an astronaut. And so he decided the first thing he would do would be to go to his library and take out some books on NASA, the very famous organization that sends American astronauts to space. However, there was an issue with his plan. This library only served white patrons. It was a segregated library. Ronald knew this, but he figured, you know what, I'm a polite kid, I can get in there and get out before anybody notices me. But as soon as he walked into that library, everybody in there, who were all white, just stared at Ronald. Ronald could feel it, but he just kept his head down and he walked through the library. He got to the science section, he grabbed a couple books he wanted, and then he walked back to the counter and he put them up, and he very politely asked the librarian, who was also white, if he could check these books out. And this librarian looks at him and says, "Young man, you better get out of here before I call the police." And Ronald at this point looks up at the librarian and thinks for a second, and then just hops up onto her counter and sits there and says, "Okay, I'll wait for the police." The librarian was totally outraged and would call the police and would call Ronald's mother. And before long, the police did show up, and it was two white guys. They come inside, and this librarian runs over to them, and she's talking to them, and she's pointing back over at Ronald, gesticulating that very clearly Ronald is the issue. That's why you've been called here. And the officers would be just totally annoyed by this librarian, and they would say to her, "Why don't you just let the kid take the books out?" And the librarian was totally offended at this and began defending her decision to call the police instead of letting him take the books out. And as she's defending herself, Ronald's mother comes running into the library. She runs over to her son to make sure he's okay, and then she looks up at the police officers and this librarian to try to figure out what's going on. And at this point, the police officers are just totally over it, and they turn to the librarian and they say, "You know what, you really ought to let him take the books out." And then the officers just turned around and left. The librarian was not about to just let him take the books. She was still very upset, and so she storms over to Ronald's mother and she says to her, "You shouldn't let your son come in here." And at this, Ronald's mother is looking at this librarian who's totally upset, and she looks down at her son who's got his head down, and then she notices the few books on the counter about space, and she was aware of Ronald's love for outer space, and she put together what had happened. And after thinking about it for a moment, she looks up at this librarian and she just says, "Well, since he's here already, can he take out those books? He'll take good care of them." The librarian is still totally furious, but knows this is a losing fight, and so very reluctantly, with a scowl on her face, she grabs the books and she jams them into Ronald's arms. And Ronald's mother nudges Ronald and says, "What do you say?" And Ronald, while holding all of his new books about NASA and space, looks up at the librarian and smiles and says, "Thank you, ma'am." And then he and his mom turn around and they leave. Ronald would go on to earn his PhD in physics from MIT, one of the most prestigious universities in the world, and after graduation he was picked up by NASA to become an astronaut. And in 1984, Ronald went into outer space. He was actually the second African American to ever go into outer space. And while he was in orbit, apparently he played his saxophone for his crew. And then in 1986, Ronald was chosen again to go on another mission to outer space, but tragically, 73 seconds after takeoff, their space shuttle, the Challenger, exploded, killing Ronald and the 6 other astronauts on board. Following his death, the library in South Carolina that had tried to turn Ronald away for his skin color renamed themselves the Ronald McNair Life History Center. The United States formally entered World War II in December of 1941, following the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in Hawaii by the Japanese. Roughly 6 months later, a 21-year-old Alabama native named Henry Irwin joined the Army Reserve. After nearly 2 years of additional military training, Henry was made into a radio operator and was assigned to a B-29 bomber. A B-29 bomber is this huge aircraft whose sole purpose is to drop bombs. And so in February of 1945, Henry and his B-29 bomber unit were sent to the Pacific to do just that, drop bombs on the Japanese. 2 months after arriving, Henry's B-29 was tasked with being the lead bomber in a group attack on a Japanese chemical facility located about 125 miles north of Tokyo. Aside from just operating his radio inside of the B-29, occasionally Henry's job was to organize the other planes in the attack when their B-29 was the lead attacker. And so the way he would do this was by dropping a series of smoke bombs out of his plane, and then once they touched the ground and all the smoke was coming up, he would hop on his radio and communicate with the other pilots in his sortie and tell them to organize themselves off of this visual reference point on the ground. He would basically have them fly to certain positions relative to the smoke cloud. And so once all the pilots had been organized into proper formation, they would continue to their target and commence their bombing raid. For this mission, Henry was in his typical position right behind the front turret gun towards the front of the plane. When his pilot told him to start dropping smoke bombs, Henry did as he was told. And so he pulled the lever, which opened up a chute on the bottom of the plane, and all these smoke bombs began tumbling out of it. Now, as soon as he pulled that lever, all of these smoke bombs that were in that particular chute were ignited. They were on a timed fuse, and so they would tumble out of the plane, and then before hitting the ground, they would ignite, and then smoke would start billowing out of them. But for some reason, after he pulled that lever, a couple of the smoke bombs fell out of the chute, but one of them kind of got turned around, and as it tumbled down, it kind of caught itself on the lip and bounced back up into the plane, and it struck Henry square in the face, shattering his nose, and then it ignited and literally lit Henry's face on fire, which instantly blinded him. Smoke bombs are not considered lethal devices because they do not explode the way typical bombs do. However, make no mistake about it, you would not want to be near a military-grade smoke bomb when it went off. In order for it to emit that very thick and long-lasting smoke that it does, the smoke bomb ignites a chemical fire within itself that burns extremely hot. And so when the smoke bomb came back inside the plane and ignited right in front of Henry, those chemicals landed on his face, and so that's why he caught on fire. And if that wasn't bad enough, the smoke bomb also filled the plane completely with smoke, making it impossible for the pilots to see anything. Despite his burning, shattered face, all Henry could think about was if he didn't get this smoke bomb off the plane in the next few seconds, they were all going to crash and die. So instead of trying to put out his burning face, Henry began feeling around on the ground for the smoke bomb, which again is basically like a fireball, and when he found it, he pulled it into his chest, trying to smother it as best as he could. And while his body completely engulfed in flames, Henry began low-crawling his way towards the front of the plane, where he knew, just by touch, there was going to be a window. And so as he agonizingly crawled, he's on fire, he finally gets to this window, he can feel it above him, and he manages to lift the smoke bomb up and throws it out the window. And then afterwards, he collapses on the ground and he passes out completely on fire, fully expecting to die. A few seconds later, the smoke inside of the plane cleared because now the smoke bomb was gone, and the pilot who had put the plane on autopilot but did have to drop significantly in altitude because they were starting to stall, finally could see again and saw they were about 300 feet from hitting the water. And so he was able to pull back and get them out of their dive, and he narrowly escaped crashing into the water, and he turned around and began flying back to base. On this return trip, the crew, who were unhurt, began assessing the damage, and they saw Henry on fire on the side of the plane, and so they rushed over and they put him out with a fire extinguisher, expecting him to be dead, but to their shock and horror, he was still alive. And so they gave him morphine for his pain and expected him to die any moment, but Henry didn't die. Instead, he was very cheerful on the flight all the way back to base, and he would ask each of his crew members if they were okay, and they would all say, "Yeah, I'm just fine. It's really you who we're concerned about here." When the pilot finally landed back at base, Henry's body had stiffened up so dramatically from being on fire that the doctors couldn't actually get him out of the plane's side door, and so they had to dismantle the side of the plane to get Henry out. And so the doctors fully expected Henry was going to die basically any moment from his horrible wounds, but since he hadn't yet, they did everything they could to try to save him. They put him through dozens of surgeries, including one where they would try to remove the chemical flecks from the smoke bomb that had embedded in his eyes. And since these chemicals combusted as soon as they made contact with oxygen, every time they pulled out one of these flecks, it would burst into flames and very painfully burn Henry's eyes a little bit more. While Henry was undergoing all these surgeries, the rest of his B-29 crew immediately went to their commanding officer and said, "You have to put Henry in for the Medal of Honor." The Medal of Honor is the highest award you can achieve in the US military. After the commanding officer heard the story of what Henry had done, he agreed, and in record time, he got the paperwork processed and got Henry approved for this award. But there were no actual physical medals of honor on the island to actually present to Henry, and the officers and the rest of his crew were worried Henry would die before the actual medal was shipped out to the island to be given to him. And so the only Medal of Honor that was on this island was inside of a museum behind a glass case. And so one of the officers in Henry's crew went into the museum, shattered the case, took the display Medal of Honor, and rushed to Henry's bedside and put it around his neck. And then after that, somehow Henry just didn't die. After dozens and dozens of surgeries, Henry actually regained sight in one of his eyes and regained the use of most of his body. Henry would later be asked in an interview what it was like to do this very heroic thing that he did. And he would say, "Well, I only moved the bomb 13 feet, but 13 feet feels like 13 miles when you're on fire." Henry would go on to be honorably discharged from the military, and he would spend the next 37 years working closely with other burn victims, trying to keep them positive and optimistic about their recovery. He would also go on to have 4 children, one of which became an Alabama state senator. In 2002, Henry died of natural causes at the age of 80.